Good morning, ChurchOne. There's been a lot written in this pandemic about happiness, I guess, as people are struggling to figure out how to be happy in such interesting times. And one of the leading voices that has emerged is this writer by the name of Arthur Brooks. He writes a lot in the New York Times and the Atlantic Monthly. And he's written a lot about the science of happiness. He comes at it from a really secular perspective. There's not much of a religious motivation at all in what he does. But I find his work interesting and thought-provoking as he reflects on different areas of happiness. And a couple weeks ago, he wrote an article about money and happiness. It seems like, most of us kind of all feel like, if we had a little bit more money, we'd all be a little bit happier. And he reflected on that and came to the conclusion, based on a lot of different research, that there's a certain economic threshold where, if you're below this amount of money, life can be pretty happy. But once you reach a certain state financially, I don't remember that state, you're probably all wondering what it is, but once you reach a certain state financially, increased money doesn't necessarily raise the level of happiness by the same amount. And it's sort of like a diminishing marginal return on money and happiness. And so he wrote this article on what to do with excess money. What do you do? What do people do with excess money that really helps them discover more happiness? He came up with 3 things that I thought were interesting. The first one is that people with excess money that are happier invest that money in experiences. They don't tend to waste it on stuff. They tend to invest in experiences, be them trips, vacations, sporting events, museums, concerts, whatever. That investments in that place tended to increase happiness a little bit more. The second thing that people did with excess money that increased happiness more than other things was they did what he described as buying time. And by that, he simply meant that they would use the money to pay people to do things that they didn't want to do, like maybe clean their house or drive their kids or mow the lawn or whatever it is. Whatever they could do to buy back time to do things they enjoyed tended to increase their happiness. Now, you're probably thinking, no duh, at this point he hasn't really said things that are probably earth-shattering, but I found his third reason really interesting, again, coming from a secular perspective. He said that the third thing that people with excess money do that brings them joy is to give, to find causes or things that they believe in and to actually invest their resources in those things. That investment of their stuff in causes that are bigger than themselves are one of the main ways that people with excess money find joy. That one surprised me a little bit, I would have expected something around the first two. I wouldn't have expected that coming from this article. But as I reflected on it more, maybe it shouldn't have. There's a famous thinker named Erik Erikson. I guess he's a psychologist, a philosopher, or whatever you want to call him. But he wrote a lot about the different seasons of life. And he said that in different seasons, different questions and different challenges emerge. Like, for example, an infant, really, the challenge for an infant is the idea of trust. And the challenge for an adolescence is the question of identity. But at the end of a life, Erikson argues that the preeminent question that rises up before people in figuring their life out is what he calls generativity. And generativity is just this simple capacity to give. You can hear the word generous sort of ensconced in that word. That there comes a point in your life, if you want to live life well, you're going to want to give. Not just financially, but finances are a part of it. Generativity is described as a concern for and a commitment to promoting the well-being of others, in particular a future generation. Generative people want to start caring for the people and values and the valued things in their life that they think will ultimately outlast them. And that's why people like to invest their resources in giving. And it seems to me that we are all, like when it comes to life, we're all given different things. We're given resources, we're given money, we're given talent, we're given breaks and opportunities, we're given relationships. And a lot of these things, when we really look at our lives, we realize these things have been given to us. We can't necessarily say that we earned them. I will never, ever be able to look at you and say that I earned my wife, Ann, or I earned my 4 kids, or I earned a lot of the career opportunities that I've had. Really, all of them have been gifts. So we've been given a lot, but then there's something in life that calls us to give. We really don't feel satisfied just keeping what we've been given, but we long to share it and give it. I remember watching the movie Saving Private Ryan, and most of you are probably familiar with the theme, but it's basically a story about a group of soldiers in World War II coming out of D-Day who go and really rescue and try to bring home this one soldier, Private Ryan, whose other siblings had been killed in the war, and they're trying to bring him home to reunite him with his family. And they finally discover Private Ryan, and they're about to bring him home when the Germans launch a counteroffensive in D-Day, and many of these soldiers give up their lives to save Private Ryan. And the one main character is played by Tom Hanks. He's a captain, and as he lays dying, he turns to Private Ryan and he says to him, "Earn this, earn this." And the movie kind of ends with now the elder Private Ryan. He was a young man in the war, obviously, but now it fast forwards to a man in his 70s or in 80s, and he's coming back to Normandy, and he's walking the graveyards of Normandy. And he looks and he finds the grave of this captain played by Tom Hanks, and he drops to his knees in tears, and he turns to his daughter, and he just looks at her and he says, "Tell me I've been a good man. Tell me I've been a good man." That's that longing for generativity, that longing to want to take what you've been given and give it to others. There's something about a well-lived life that just longs to give. And we all long to give, but here's the challenge with giving. It's actually really hard to give. Now, it's hard to give for a lot of simple reasons. We're selfish, we're lazy, all that kind of stuff is obvious. But even beyond our selfishness and our laziness, there's even greater challenges when it comes to giving. It's hard to give and be successful in giving. Do you realize that? You know, a lot of what you give to, you're never gonna really know if it worked or if it delivered what you wanted it to give. I pour my life a lot into these sermons every week, you know. People ask me a lot, like, what's it like preparing for a sermon? I mean, one of the descriptions I give is it's kind of like living with a final exam every week. Even when you're not working on it, you're working on it and you're thinking about it, and you don't really relax until the exam is over. And you know, you give and you do all this, and I love to give it, and I'm not complaining, and all of you, I'm sure, have profound challenges in your job and work and calling, so I'm not trying to complain when I say that. I'm simply saying, like, this is an area where I try to give. But you know, it's interesting. I write a lot of my sermons, not all of them, but I write a lot of them in this notebook, and so when I get to write a new sermon, sometimes I flip back in my notebook and I see notes from other sermons. And it's interesting to go back over those notes and realize I don't even totally remember what I was saying back then. Even my own sermons that I pour my heart into, sometimes it's hard to measure, right? Like, how much is given and how successful is it? Another reason it's hard to gift is that your gift may not be received with the gratitude that you hope for. Dan McAdams says that we will all invest ourselves in things that are bound to fail or experience limited success or receive less gratitude than we expected to get when we give. There's a great line in Shakespeare from King Lear. It says, "How sharper than a serpent's tooth is to have a thankless child." That's a great example of places where, you know, you may give a lot as a parent and you don't receive the gratitude that you might have expected. And you know, I thought about that, and like in my own life, and I would never call myself a thankless child. I wasn't. I was grateful for what my parents gave, you know. But as I reflect on even my mom and dad, the longer I live, my parents have both passed away, and the longer I live, the more I want to thank them. Because the more now I understand just exactly how much they were giving, and they're not even around anymore for me to be able to say thank you. Now I get it, but they're not even here. And so giving is a challenge because it may not be met with the success that you would expect from the amount you give, nor will it maybe be received with the appreciation that you long for. So if we long to give, but we're giving, we'll have limited success and appreciation, where does the motivation come from to give? What is going to make us keep giving when giving isn't seeming to return what we longed for? I think the best motivation for giving comes from the story that you tell. That really, to be a generative, giving person, you're going to need to tell a story that's bigger than any expected appreciation you receive, bigger than even any expected results that you would think that would come with what you've given. You're going to need a story that is bigger than that. What's going to pull you through and keep you giving when the rewards aren't there? The story you tell will often dictate the actions you take. And by story, hear me say this, I'm not talking about some fictional fable. I'm talking about your view of life. What is going to shape your sense of what life is really all about? Because if you get that into focus, it makes it more possible to give, not less. And that leads me to today's reading. In today's reading, the Apostle John is writing to a group of people that could have easily been discouraged by the return they were getting on the things that they had given up. Here they had kind of walked away in a profound way out of God's calling. They walked away from their heritage, the religion that they grew up in, and they embraced the resurrected Christ as their Savior, which would have distinguished them from kind of their culture at large and maybe isolated them a little bit and put them on the outs. And they made this great big sacrificial move to do all of this, which was a profound sacrifice and a real act of giving of their faith in their life to God. And yet in the midst of that, there grew up amongst their own community that had walked away in faith a number of people that began to believe the wrong things about Jesus and began to teach about something that many call Docetism, which just basically comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means that these people began to teach that Jesus wasn't truly a human being, but he was a spirit that sort of appeared and sort of made himself look like a human being, but really wasn't. And believe it or not, these ideas, which might seem strange to us today, led to a fracture in their community. And so then on one hand, they're kind of abandoned by their heritage. On another hand, they're sort of pulled asunder by people that are fracturing their community. And it would be easy to get discouraged. It'd be easy to stop giving. And it's in the midst of this that the Apostle John writes them a letter challenging them to take the generative path of love. Because that path of love, the story of love that they would tell themselves, would enable them to keep moving. The passage is 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 to 23. Let me read it here. And all I'm going to talk about is I want you to hear how John is encouraging them to change the story that they are telling. It says this, "Now this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. If our hearts condemn us, we know that God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask, because we keep his commands and do what pleases him. And this is his command, to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he has commanded us. Paul is encouraging a discouraged group of people that are being asked to give again and again and again to change their story. In verse 16, he says, this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. The courage of love is and the currency of love is not good feelings, Paul says. That comes and goes. The real story that you ought to tell in love, about love, the real understanding that you ought to know about love is that love is born out in circumstance and sacrifice. Why sacrifice? Why? Because there's something about sacrificial love that really, gives of your life. I say this a lot of times, but I got in the habit a while ago of reading obituaries. And again, as you read obituaries, you realize that most people's lives are marked by where they sacrificed, where they chose to give of their hearts to others. That's what love really is. And the reason that we know that is what love is, John says in this passage, is because that's exactly what Jesus did for us. He laid down his life for us. He didn't hold on to it. He gave it up for us. And that is the example, that is the story that we tell of love. But it's interesting, he goes on to talk about, he gives this example. He says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, he says, let us not love with words or speech, but in actions and truth. I listened to a Bible Project podcast this week that I thought was really great, and it talked about the culture of the New Testament letters. And it said to really appreciate them and to put them in their context, it's to really get your head around the socioeconomic reality of the people, the lives of the actual people that these letters are being written to. And these people weren't growing up and living in a modern welfare state like we are. They were really living in first century Roman world where most of the people, the huge majority of the population, was really living on the level of subsistence. And John said it wouldn't be hard for John to say, when you look around you, you're going to see people in need. And what are you going to do with the people that you see in need? Are you going to give? Because that's kind of what love is. Love would give. And the reason that love would give is because love thinks us. It doesn't think me. And that's what John says. This is how you give. Having a mindset of giving, right, isn't born out of a story of what gratitude or impact you'll make. It's born out of an understanding that this is about us. This is about us. And I give because you're a part of us. And that's what motivates me to give. It was interesting. I was thinking when I was preparing for this, when we adopted Matt, we went with the Williamses, Rob and Debbie Williams, to go here, and they adopted their son Ryan the same time we adopted Matt. And the foster mom of Rob and Debbie Williams' child, Ryan, invited the four of us over for dinner the night before we were going to fly out to take our young children home and fly back to America. So the night before this daunting 14-hour plane ride with these newly adopted little boys, we're invited to this dinner at this Korean home. And I'll never forget that night. We get on the subway, we take this long subway ride in the city of Seoul, and we get off the subway, and we kind of we start heading to the exits, when all of a sudden this young Korean girl comes up and she hands me a cell phone. And I pick up the cell phone, and the English, broken English on the phone just says, follow this girl, she will take you where you need to go. I give her back the cell phone. I think to myself, is this the end? We're walking around kind of like some rougher streets in Seoul, Korea, and I'm just blindly following this person. And we walk into this apartment, and there before us is this incredible spread of food. And you could tell these people didn't have a lot, but they invested a lot in trying to feed us. Now, the really unfortunate thing was, this is the night before we're about to take these adopted kids, meet these adopted kids, and then we're going to fly back to the United States, a long plane ride. The four of us were all terrified of eating something that would just make us brutally sick, because we had no margin for that kind of thing. And so this incredible spread is laid before us, and the four of us Americans are nibbling around the edges, eating a roll here, a little piece of fruit here, but we were all terrified to dig in. And they couldn't speak English, and we couldn't speak Korean, and so it was hard to communicate, and they're kind of staring at us like, what are you going to do with all this food? And I think it became clear to them that we just weren't going to eat a lot of it. And so all of a sudden, boom, the apartment fills up with 20 other people, and they just start grabbing the food and eating. And I know what happened is that somehow word got out that this food was all going to go to waste. And so, boom, everybody comes in and, starts eating. And we're surrounded by Koreans eating bulgogi and all this stuff, and we're just thinking, what's going on? But what I found so interesting about the mindset in that moment with those Korean people was, they weren't going to hoard something or hold on to something, because this is us. We got more. Let's give it away. Let's not hold on to it. And I think that when you think like that, when you tell a different story, when your story isn't just about me, but it's about us, you give. You give regardless of who takes it. They meant to give to us. We didn't take it, so they gave it to someone else, because this is us. Not the TV show, but the reality, right? And giving is easy when you look at it that way. So I don't know what it looks like to give for you to think this is us, But I challenge you to start thinking that way. Because look at what happens when you think that way. It's interesting what John goes on to say. He says he makes certain promises that this kind of new mindset produces inside of you. He says in verse 19, he says, this is how we know that we belong. Later on, he says, this is how our hearts, in verse 21, can have confidence before God. And then in verse 22, he says, we can know that we will receive whatever we ask for. John says you can have this kind of mindset if you tell a different story, if you realize that the reason you give is because you've been loved sacrificially by Jesus, and now you're a part of, it's not just about you, but it's about us. And if you begin to think differently like that, you'll have confidence before God, and you'll understand that you can ask God for whatever you want. And it's easier to give when you feel like you have what you need. The good life, Arthur Brooks would say, is the generous life. And I think he's right. But the challenge is, generosity doesn't just work if you give to get. Generosity works if you get and then you give. When you begin to tell a different story about what matters most in life, when you see that you get the great gift of Jesus' love, and then you get to be a part of His family, when you understand those things and you can approach God with confidence and know that God can give you everything that you need, that you can get from Him, you have the capacity to give. And when you give, you will lay hold of life indeed. This is us, ChurchOne. Tell a better story. Be givers. God bless. Thanks.